Robynne, in May, the G20 is going to be meeting, and no surprise probably, but food is on the agenda. What's going to be discussed?
I think it is a little bit surprising that food is on the agenda. The G8 spoke about food for the first time in probably its history back in 2009, and now the G20 is focused on the topic, and most particularly around the angle of food price volatility. So with the rise in commodities, which is good for agriculture because it sends a production signal to encourage farmers to produce more, the curious response in a state of being where agriculture has been perhaps underproducing to meet long-term needs has been a discussion about what we can do to reduce food price volatility, because it is a huge impact on hunger levels around the world, and with that, government stability.
So it does seem strange to me that we rarely talk about food. Food is what we need to obviously live. Why is it taking so long to get on the agenda?
Well, basically, the world abandoned agriculture. It was about almost 20% of overseas development assistance back in the 70s. And bit by bit, the world has clawed back on supporting agriculture and said it was unimportant and unimportant. Until, unfortunately, it took the food crisis of 2007 for people to wake up and realize that if you drop agricultural support from almost 20% down to 3%, that there is going to be a consequence. And, Africa is unfortunately a profound example of that. So the need is really there for agriculture to be refunded through overseas development, but also through a functioning markets. And I think the discussion about food price volatility is very interesting for that very reason.
So you mentioned food price or food security and food price volatility. What kind of measures are going to be discussed, and what is this group willing to possibly do in order to counteract some of these things?
Well, it's a bit speculative at this point. The French are leading the G20, and in addition to the G20 meeting in May, there will be the first ever agricultural ministers meeting of the G20 in June that follows. And both are focused primarily on the issues of food price volatility, but more broadly food security. And what I'm hearing is a very wide array of potential outcomes or potential topics of discussion. Everything from what's the role of speculators in commodity markets, can they be extracted from commodity markets, some discussion about whether or not grain companies should be allowed to contract privately for grain or whether that has to flow through a commodity market, whether government should be allowed to stockpile or whether there should be an international effort to stockpile some grains for a buffer, in effect, for hunger aid. And I think that's an interesting question because the World Food Program usually has to go buy food exactly when food prices are going up, and it becomes a big issue about how to source. They're also talking about whether or not there should be more subsidies, and what is the role or no role for food import and export bans. So really big issues that could fundamentally change the way food is moving around the world.
So I think one of the issues is that when a lot of farmers hear about these kinds of meetings and they see sort of the clips on CBC News World, it looks like a whole bunch of important people getting together in very nice suits, and it's hard to see or get an idea of what kind of impact this would actually have on your farm. Why do you think that farmers should be concerned or at least thinking about some of the potential outcomes of some of these meetings?
Well, I'm very concerned that there's been very little reaction amongst Canadian farm organizations so far as I've seen, because I think we have to be very organized as a farm community about this meeting. These decisions could very directly impact the markets for food, and they could drive them up, they could drive them down, or at best they could be perhaps value neutral, but the impact could be very really felt this harvest by the signal sent at the G20.
So what is Canada's, position, what is Canada's position in the global agricultural kind of, spectrum, for lack of a better term? Are we a power broker at the table, or are we just quietly listening, or we're trying to strike a committee, or what's kind of where we sit?
Canada is a big player in many respects, particularly around overseas development assistance, and we're also a large producer. So we have a lot at the table, but certainly if the Russians and the Americans and the Indian and the Chinese and the Brazilians get together and make some decisions, it's going to be hard for Canada to stand back from that. There will be a big move, and it will be a very powerful move.
So, do you see the global initiative to be lowering subsidies or looking at changing the way that they're distributed?
I think the subsidy question is unresolved. I think at this point it's likely that some of the more traditional subsidizers, in terms of the countries that have been more engaged in subsidies, might be looking at bringing that back a bit. But I think the more profound questions is to what extent do they want to potentially tinker in the marketplace to change the way that agricultural goods are flowing to try and even out prices. I think perhaps one of the most value-neutral solutions is to talk about how you create a hedge for countries that are at risk of increased hunger and really must have some way of accessing reasonable resources, either through a bit of stockpiling or particularly through a fund or a hedging mechanism to allow them to be able to access grain at a reasonable price point.
Well, I was going to say, I know that about a year ago I interviewed Jeffrey Simpson, columnist with the Globe and Mail, and Jeff had said at the time that eventually countries at some of these discussions are going to get tired of Canada because Canada plays both sides of the fence. We want a free market, but then we obviously lobby hard for the wheat board. We obviously lobby hard for dairy supply managed. Do you see that kind of sentiment?
I think that's an issue, particularly in the trade negotiations. I think the price volatility discussion is interesting because it's part trade negotiation, but it's also part overseas development. It's also part productive capacity, and Canada is a huge player in global exports of grain still, although dropping all the time, something we need to be addressing much faster. And it's also part truly food aid, and how is the best way to set that up. So Canada, I think, has a certain credibility on overseas development assistance. We've been the first ones in coming out of the G8 with actual money for agriculture, despite all the promises. Most countries haven't come through with a dime. Canada has been there participating on that. So I think we have a credibility there, even if the trade discussion it's a little bit 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Okay, Robynne, thanks a lot, and we'll definitely talk again and after the meetings happen and sort of review was there any surprises or what came out of it and what's the next step. So we'll talk to you again soon.
Great.